So you've probably seen a version of this story structure before. This is the kind of save the cat, hero's journey, etc. Today we're going to take this from this to this. I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and story nerd. Welcome back to my channel. I am so excited today to be talking about story structure, story framework, story theory. This is applicable whether you are writing a book, a screenplay, a short story, anything like that. I love thinking through these frameworks. Specifically, let's go back to this one. This is usually what you start with. This is what I started with when I was a new baby writer. I read The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler, and this is kind of what I knew. Then I read The Anatomy of Story and Save the Cat. You'll notice that this is a kind of amalgamation of all three of those, just using the terminology that makes the most sense. They are all more or less the same in terms of the general structure, but we will go through it. This part, though, I have added bits in that help me in my writing. So there's a whole lot to a story, obviously, a successful story, other than just these beats. And it's obviously there's character arc and character development. That's one. And then there is the problem framework. There's what's actually happening in the plot. So what I'm trying to do in this video is put the story structure alongside the character arc framework, alongside the plot framework. Now, I think of plot pretty much as just like what problem is the character solving, a series of problems for the characters to solve. And that gives kind of the problem theory of story. And you might have seen this around as well, the kind of sequence of problems that a character is solving. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through this. We're going to build up to here one by one. We're going to use an example, two examples. We're going to use The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Inside Out 2. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I'm trying to pull from they're both kind of movies. The movies are a little bit more straightforward, and I think it should give a good idea of a fantasy versus more of a contemporary type story as well. So let's get straight on into it. Obviously, we start with the ordinary world in our little story structure circle, the defining crisis in our purple circle, that's our character arc, and the motivating problem in our blue circle. So ordinary world or story setup, that's where the character begins. We're getting an introduction to the current equilibrium. We generally have a character who has some sort of problem. We're learning about their life. So that's our ordinary world. Within the ordinary world, we are understanding who this character is. They're generally a character or a person with something to learn. They have a weakness, a need, and an existing problem. So why I call this the defining crisis on the character arc is because in this initial structure, when you're writing it on the page, you want to include a scene where the character makes a decision or takes an action. I like decisions that illustrate where they are on their character arc. So it's their defining crisis of this is who they are now. And that crisis ideally demonstrates their weakness or need. At the same time, you have a motivating problem. And I've talked to a couple writers about this before, where it's like, I have to have a problem at the start of my book, but then there's an inciting incident that comes in later. So are there multiple problems? But there's supposed to be an overall like major traumatic question. So what do I do? I call this the motivating problem. This could be a big part of the character's motivations. Obviously, it's the problem that is kind of lurking in the background. In my own story, my character really wants to get into a music conservatory. It's a huge deal. It's super important to her family. She's rested her whole identity on it. And the story problem is a heist, but that's the motivating problem. That's the motivating problem. That's the problem that is giving her the motivation to go forward, if that makes sense. And I like to think of motivation as a problem, kind of, that I'm trying to solve versus, oh, the character, wants adventure or the character wants love or something like that. That's harder to write versus if your motivating problem is like the character needs to get to Cabo or the character needs to get into this school or the character wants to win the competition or whatever is happening on that motivating level. Gives you more to work with. So let's get to the example. I don't want to take too long. This is going to turn into a long video. We're only on number 1. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in our ordinary world, this is when the German bombers attack London. Terrified, I'm going to walk you through the scene here. The Pevensies flee to their bomb shelter where they bicker and argue. At the same time, Edmund turns around from the group, rushes away, and saves a picture of his father. This is our very first scene, and it gives us a sense of our defining crisis and motivating problem. So I will say that Edmund's defining crisis happens, the real defining one happens a little bit later, but there is a crisis where he turns to go get the picture of his father, which is a very scared, selfish move. So we can have multiple defining crises here, but that's giving an indication of his character. We're also seeing that there's a war. That's a motivating problem here. And we're also seeing the tension in the family, the arguing, the bickering between them. Also kind of part of that background motivating problem. Also in the ordinary world, the Pevensey siblings are evacuated from London. Sorry, I have my notes here. Are evacuated from London and they're sent to live in the countryside. In Inside Out 2, our ordinary world, Riley is doing great. Our motivating problem here, though, is that she has a great belief system, but Joy is getting rid of her bad memories to protect that belief system. And in her defining crisis, we see her getting rid of a bad memory and going, bye, like putting it into the wind, versus, letting it stay in her headquarters. So let's move to the next one, which is our call to adventure. This is when we get a sense of what the story is going to be about. We maybe don't have the full indication of where we're going, but this is when the character is called to act or change, basically. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, this is when Lucy discovers the magical wardrobe, meets Mr. Tummis, and hears about the White Witch. This is obviously from a story structure perspective, call to adventure. This is where we're going. This is the promise that is put into the reader's mind or the viewer's mind of, okay, this is where the story is going. At the same time, it's super important on the character arc. It's an invitation to act or change. Part of this, if we're in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and we're in the character arc, we are going to follow Edmund's arc specifically. So in this invitation to act or change, Lucy comes back and he makes fun of her. So do all the siblings, but Edmund does especially. And then we have the story problem. So this is where that is starting to be introduced. So we hear about the White Witch, who's going to be our villain, and defeating the White Witch is our story problem. Have we gotten any detail on that at this point? Not really, but it's there. In Inside Out 2, this is when Riley is invited to hockey camp, and she finds out that her friends are going to a different school. I would say that the friends are going to a different school is a bit of the kind of motivating problem. We really do have 2 story threads in Inside Out 2. We have the external story of what Riley's doing, and then we have the story of what her internal emotions are doing. So from Riley's perspective, her kind of motivating problem is that her friends are going to a different school. She's about to start high school. Very scary. From the emotions perspective, the story problem here, or the motivating problem here, is Joy wants to protect Riley's belief system and keep her happy. The story problem is that the puberty button is pushed and new emotions show up. This is like anxiety. I don't remember all the names of the other emotions, but a ton of them show up. And they want to get rid of those old emotions or the new emotions. And that brings us to refusal of the call. This is when the characters are resisting the change. So literally they're saying, oh, you want me to do that? No, thank you. This is when Lucy returns from Narnia and none of her siblings believe her. Edmund even mocks her about it. And then when he follows her, he tells his siblings that she was lying. He's pretending he doesn't believe his sister. He's lying to them. He's sparking discord in the family. And he's also, it's part of his plan to bring his family to Narnia. So this is, where we have Edmund. He is given an opportunity to support his sister, to say, hey, like, she is telling the truth. And he turns that opportunity down. You could say that that's also a bit of a defining crisis. It's also the refusal of the call. In Inside Out, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but this is when the old emotions try to pretend that the new emotions don't exist. Then we get to our crossing of the threshold. This is when the character is forced to change. So they are forced to act, not change, but forced to act. So I'm in my equilibrium, I'm in my stasis, and I'm trying to resist. I want to stay in my stasis forever. This is the moment where I can no longer do that. So this is when the children go into the wardrobe and cross the threshold into Narnia. We love a portal fantasy for this structure step because it just makes things so easy. um, Here, Edmund is, forced to act because he goes through the wardrobe. He, I believe, leads the way to the wardrobe, at least in the movie. And so, yes, he is acting there, and this is very much doubling down on his, his weakness there of the selfish, the scared. This inferiority complex or superiority complex in regards to his siblings. In Inside Out 2, this is Riley is at hockey camp, and she chooses the popular cool girl over her friends. This is she's crossing the threshold because normally she would just hang out with her friends. Here, by the threat of like losing her friends, she acts in a way that's very different for her. Also, on the inside, this is when the emotions, anxiety takes over the controls of the emotions. Crossing the threshold is a great one. Obviously, it's good to have an example of both a fantasy and a contemporary. I always like to use Camp Rock as an example here, if you know that movie, because crossing the threshold is not necessarily geographic. It is in Narnia, but it doesn't have to be. In Camp Rock, I think a lot of people would say, oh, obviously crossing the threshold is when she arrives at the camp. In my opinion, it is not. Crossing the threshold is when she chooses to move in to the Mean Girls cabin. And it's very similar in Inside Out. It's not when Riley goes from like school to hockey camp. She's still in her mind, kind of in her ordinary world. But when she is given the invitation to hang out with Val or hang out with her friends, she goes and hangs out with Val, and she hangs out with this new group of cool older girls. And that's her crossing the threshold. It's not the geographic change, but it's like the mindset change, the real disturbance. And sometimes that doesn't happen until they are well into a new geographic location. We're now hitting Act 2. Woohoo! All right. Act 2. Again, Act 2, things get a little messy here. I wrote down allies and opponents. Generally, this is the part that you would call your fun and games or your promise of the premise or whatever. I put in allies and opponents, which is terminology from Anatomy of Story. Here you are in Narnia, you are visiting Mr. Tummis, and they see that he's been taken by the White Witch. This is also when they meet the Beavers, who are their allies. They learn that there's a war brewing. They learn that their Aslan is here and Aslan is coming. This is also when Riley decides that she wants to be part of the in group, the older girl popular group. And this is when anxiety puts joy, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear in a jar. So here in Inside Out, we're really getting a cementation of the anxiety emotion as an opponent. And we're getting Riley's kind of, there's an opponent with that friend group dynamic there. Let's move on to our plan. Plan. So plan, again, is alongside the Act 2 problem. So I have Act 2 problem a little bit down. Basically, throughout this act, we should have there's a new problem that's introduced. So we have a motivating problem, we have a story problem, and we have an Act 2 problem. This is a goal that we're going to be working on throughout all of Act 2. It's it's a pretty boring name for it. But the plan is generally, at this point, either the introduction of the plan to solve the story problem creates the Act 2 problem. So think of a heist. I want to steal this thing. That's my story problem. Then we sit down and we start doing the breakdown of what we're going to steal and how we're going to do it, and all of these like mini things that we have to get done in order to pull off our heist. One of those mini things will likely become the overarching Act 2 problem. Or it could be, more likely like an interpersonal dynamic that becomes the Act 2 problem in your heist that you have to overcome. Throughout Act 2, there should be tons of sequences of problem, attempt to solve, fail, change, solution, or just problem, solution, or problem, problem, attempt to solve, fail, attempt to solve, fail. There should be tons of those little mini problems in there, but there's usually an overarching Act 2 problem that's, kicking its way across the whole story. In this one here, we have in Narnia, it's an interesting one. So Edmund's plan is to go to the White Witch and try to bring his siblings there. He realizes he can't bring them, so he goes to the White Witch himself. That plan creates the Act 2 problem, which is for the other Pevensies, where the hell is Edmund? He's now been kidnapped by the White Witch, and which for Edmund is, I've now been kidnapped by the White Witch. Also at this point in the plan is sticking to the old habits. So Edmund is still acting selfishly. He's still wanting to pursue that superiority over his siblings, and he's still acting out of a bit of fear. And all of that creates our Act 2 problem. You can also have it where the act, like you have the story problem, and then the Act 2 problem bubbles up, and then the Act 2 problem leads to a plan, or kind of the other way around. But they both work. I just like that those are kind of tied together. And the important thing is that whatever that cause and effect looks like, it's the character is like sticking to those old habits and stuck in their ways. When we get to Inside Out, here we have the emotions, or the plan is kind of anxiety puts joy, sadness, etc. in a jar. And joy and the emotions decide that they need to get out of this jar, and they want to go bring Riley's sense of self and bring it back to headquarters. Riley's plan is to not be alone by making friends with Val. So we see how those two steps, the allies and opponents and the plan, really kind of overlap with each other there. Our next one is drive. Again, in the Save the Cat language, this is all kind of fun and games. In Anatomy of Story language, drive, this is when I'm actively acting on my plan. So this is when Edmund disappears, he turns to the White Witch, and the Pevensies and the Beavers flee the dam to meet with Aslan. They're being chased. In Inside Out, this is when the joy and the... Sorry, I had an issue in my notes. Yes, this is when... I'm reading the wrong thing. I'm so sorry. Anyways, this is when Edmund's at the White Witch, joy and the emotions leave headquarters and go to get the sense of self. Riley starts trying to hang out with Val and her friends, and kind of makes a bit of a fool of herself doing so, and continually is ignoring her existing friends. So drive is basically our acting on the plan. Then we get to our midpoint. So at the midpoint, and there's a bit of there's different takes on this. So in the Anatomy of Story, in Save the Cat, you would call this like apparent victory or apparent defeat. That would usually be to your Act 2 problem if you go with that. I don't always love calling the midpoint like apparent victory or apparent defeat, because you have a real sense of apparent victory, apparent defeat, like for real, down here around your all is lost. So you can think of them as either one. When I did an analysis of midpoints, and if you're interested in that, I can share it with you. I was looking at a bunch of different books and what their midpoints were. What I found was most clear across all midpoints was that rather than being a moment of defeat or victory, while there's always an element of that, it was really that there is revelation and clarity on the story problem. So for example, in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, this is when we learn that they have to go to Aslan in order to get home. And our story problem is, let's say it's the war with Aslan. They learn about the war. They get an understanding of the prophecy at the midpoint here, and that they're going to play a role in it. And they also understand like where Edmund has gone. So we are getting a ton of clarity and revelations, understanding of the story problem at this point. In Inside Out, we have learned about the emotions, and we have, we have learned about the emotions, and they have a better sense of what their overall thing they're facing is, and they go do that. So really here, other examples of this would be, usually this is a moment, if it's a like more adult book, of connection, like B story, like the romance is taking off. You understand their motivations better, or the character understands their own motivations better. I'm thinking in my own story, it's when the true nature of the problem is revealed. So if there was a mystery underlying something, there can still be mysteries around who the opponent is, but if there's like a secret element to it, it's usually revealed here. Let's keep on moving into Obsessive Drive. In Obsessive Drive, this is when our characters are taking on a new approach. In some cases, in most cases, they should be doubling down on their weakness here. In other cases, they've learned things already and are starting to act a little bit differently. It varies. In Anatomy of Story, he talks a lot about this is where the decisions are getting more and more like morally corrupt. In others, though, if you had a sort of apparent defeat, or if you had a really negative turning at the midpoint, then things are getting better. Maybe your character has fully embodied a new skill and now they're starting to use it. In Narnia, we have the Pevensies crossing the river and making it to Aslan's camp as they prepare for war. And we have Edmund apologizing to Mr. Thomas. Also at this point, my notes, I'm sorry. This is not a good YouTube video. I'm being a really bad YouTuber right now. Everything's messed up in the notes. Always check your notes, eh? Okay. At the midpoint in Narnia, that's when they're trapped under the bridge. They think the White Witch is coming to get them, and it turns out to be Santa Claus, and spring is coming. That is the midpoint in Narnia. It's the Santa Claus moment. Then we get into Obsessive Drive. That's the point where the Pevensies are crossing the river and making it to Aslan's camp, and they start preparing for war there. Also in Obsessive Drive, from the character arc perspective, we have this new approach. The character is taking a new approach to the problem. Here we have Edmund apologizing to Mr. Thomas for, getting him arrested, basically. In Inside Out 2, we have Joy and Co., the emotions, fighting against anxiety by invading Imagination Land, and they are right on their way to headquarters. So they're heading through headquarters there. They, I believe, retrieved the sense of self and are trying to get back. Okay. Trying to get back. This is, again, when the story really goes into overdrive, and we have a lot going on. We're still, in many cases, working on the Act 2 problem. So we've noticed in Inside Out, our Act 2 problem has become, let's get these emotions out of headquarters. Our Act 2 problem is, let's get the sense of self back to headquarters. The story problem is, how do we deal with these new emotions? In Narnia, our Act 2 problem is that Edmund is gone, and we want to get Edmund back. Basically, Edmund is kidnapped by the White Witch. That's our Act 2 problem. Our story problem is the overarching war. So we are still working on our Act 2 problem. Edmund is he's not really doing much, but he would like to not be kidnapped by the White Witch anymore. A mini problem in here was getting the kids to Aslan's camp. In the Obsessive Drive, they do achieve that. Let's keep on moving. Here we get our apparent victory or defeat, which could also be your all is lost moment. Whatever it is, here is your lowest point. I know it sounds a little bit ambiguous here, and that's not always the best for a video like this, but I think that it really depends on the story, and this is where you shape it to what you need, right? Like, you could have the apparent defeat happen at the midpoint and then have an even worse moment happen in an all is lost at this point. Um, in some cases, though, you don't. Like, I don't think there is an apparent victory or defeat really in Narnia. I suppose Santa Claus shows up, but that's not the a victory or defeat for the Pevensies. That's just it's a revelation that spring is coming. Things are getting better. They're getting ready for the battle. So you can. I think that those are two things that you can play around with to what fits the shape of your story best. But at this point, our all is lost moment, our lowest point, generally, this is a failure to solve the Act 2 problem. It could also be a failure to solve the story problem, or at the very least, it should feel like I've failed to solve the Act 2 problem, and so the story problem is not possible. In some cases, I may have just solved the Act 2 problem, and now this is a failure to solve the story problem. And so it seems like the story problem is not possible. So this is when the White Witch arrives to demand Edmund's life. She gets to kill traitors. It's part of the Code of Narnia. So at this point, we thought we got Edmund back because he was rescued from the camp. It was an obsessive drive. Now we are told that she wants to kill Edmund. And that is the lowest point of our Act 2 problem because we wanted to get Edmund back, and now we don't have him anymore. We also have Riley's sense of self in Inside Out being overtaken by a negative belief after seeing the coach's notebook. So she sneaks out, egged on by anxiety, and she looks at the coach's notebook. She decides that she needs to score 3 goals in order to get on this team. And this is where she is really overtaken by that negative belief with the coach's notebook. And she is like super in her head about it. From the emotions perspective, this is where we have the Joy starting to cry on a pile of bad memories. From the character arc perspective, so I have rock bottom / flying high. So in a negative character arc, this would be your apparent victory moment. This would be the moment where you hope they wouldn't move forward. This would be the kind of last good moment. In a story with a positive character arc, this is your rock bottom. This is your rock bottom. Let's continue on here. We have next Dark Night of the Soul, which is Save the Cat terminology. Dark Night of the Soul is our reaction beat generally to the all is lost apparent defeat. In Narnia, the reaction beat here, Dark Night of the Soul, is when Aslan sacrifices himself and the witch executes him on the stone table. Some might say that should actually be the all is lost, but I disagree. I think the all is lost is the moment when it seems like I cannot solve the Act 2 problem, which is I need to get Edmund back. It's the moment in Inside Out when it seems like I cannot get this thing back to headquarters. That's our Act 2 problem. So when we get to Dark Night of the Soul in Narnia, I'm saying that's when Aslan is sacrificed on the stone table. Around this Dark Night of the Soul time, we also see Edmund apologizing to his siblings, hugging them, forgiving them. He is also starting to work with Peter and, train for the battle. He feels the flowers on his face that come and tell him that Aslan has died. And that's all kind of part of his character growth. He's kind of had his revelation more sort of in here when he was kidnapped, but now he's acting on it. He's starting to act on his sense of change. Here, Dark Night of the Soul, we have Joy crying on top of the bad memories because they can't get back to his headquarters. And we're seeing the result of this, which is Riley, stuck in that negative belief about the 3 goals, kind of goes insane in the scrimmage, and she's sent to the penalty box. And it's there that she is going to have her revelation / break into 3. This is the point where we solve the Act 2 problem. Finally, yay! We've had this Act 2 problem for a really long time. Again, there should be a bunch of small problems along the way. But here we are solving our Act 2 problem. Yay! In this bit, as we're trying to solve the Act 2 problem, that solution pushes us forward, launches us into the last quarter of the story through Act 3 or Act 4, whatever you want to call this. But it does bring the story problem into harsher light. It becomes more and more desperate. Also, at this point, you can have the motivating problem kind of re-bubble up. I can think of my own story with this, which is basically she wants to get into the conservatory. Once, this beat is overcome, we've solved the Act 2 problem, and we're going to execute the final bit of the heist. The heist is also her audition for this conservatory. And so you have that motivating problem kind of coming back around. I believe in Narnia, there's a moment where they mention their father around this point, which is, again, a reminder of that motivating problem. But we are ready. We've had a solution, and we are ready to tackle our story problem for the rest of the book. In Narnia, this is when Aslan is gone, Edmund is safe. So that's the solution of the Act 2 problem, was the deal between Aslan and the White Witch. And this is when Peter decides to lead the battle against the White Witch with Edmund by his side. So now we definitely have Edmund. That solves our Act 2 problem. Story problem is we have this war with the White Witch. Peter says, okay, I'm taking control. We're going forward. From the inside out perspective, I feel like I just have so many issues with this. Why is it this? None of it is in line. Okay. Anyways, this is when the emotions call Pouchy. The emotions call Pouchy, and Pouchy helps them get back to headquarters. They realize they can get help from Pouchy. Continuing on. This next bit here, we get into our battle. Through the battle, which is summarized very quickly here, we are solving our story problem. So there's a long sequence to solve that story problem. Within the battle, we have our act as changed. So at this point, we know that Edmund has learned to be, more selfless, and to kind of respect and love his siblings and treat them with love and not want to be superior to them. So we see him acting as an inferior almost to Peter, sticking by Peter's side, supporting Peter the whole time. He is acting as changed in this battle. The battle, of course, in Narnia is literally the battle with the White Witch. Within here, we have Aslan getting resurrected. He and the girls, bring reinforcements to help turn the tide of the battle through that sequence. That's through the sequence. At the sort of pinnacle climax of the battle, we have Aslan killing the White Witch. I'm going to pause. There's something else that happens there, but let's just talk about Inside Out. At this point in the battle, Joy gets back to headquarters and battles anxiety for the controls. As she's doing that, externally, Riley is having a panic attack, which is, not good. The part that is being changed here, in the battle, Joy realizes she needs to relinquish control, and the emotions hug. So we'll notice through here that in Inside Out, versus where Edmund started to get his self-revelation around kind of here, with Inside Out, we're getting the self-revelation around here. Anyways, our battle is literally in headquarters, a battle between the emotions. And then externally, this is when Riley has a conversation with her friends. So it can be as crazy as your Narnia battle literally on the battlefield, and as simple as a conversation with friends. And that would be solving the story problem. Riley's story problem, of course, of her friends are going to different schools and she's really nervous about it. And she wants to have friends. She doesn't want to be alone. So this here, I have new equilibrium, reinforcing crisis, and resolve motivating problem. It always gets tricky at the end because in a lot of times, this reinforcing crisis could be before the battle, it could be during the battle, it could be after the battle. By reinforcing crisis, this is supposed to be your mirror moment between the defining crisis, where we see kind of once and for all that the character has changed. We see that Edmund has been supporting Peter. We see, that he's had a change in attitude. We see that he's apologized. But in the reinforcing crisis is when he sacrifices himself to break the White Witch's wand, and he gets terribly stabbed and appears like he's going to die. So going from that moment of complete selfishness right here to complete selflessness right here. He's totally, totally selfless. He risks his life. He sacrifices himself to break the White Witch's stick. At this point, this is when Joy has a revelation, and she willingly relinquishes the controls over to Anxiety. That's her reinforcing crisis. So here she was saying, we're going to ignore these emotions. We're going to try to get them out of headquarters. I'm staying in control. Here she finally relinquishes her control. And externally, Riley's friends check on her and she apologizes. So she is saying, look, I got really anxious about the fact that we're switching schools, and I'm sorry for ditching you for Val. At this point, we get into our new equilibrium and the resolving of the motivating problem. This should really be a little bit further down. It should be like here. Anyways, obviously in Narnia, the children become the rulers. There's peace and caring among the family, and the Narnians, they stumble back through the wardrobe. At this point, Edmund is friends with his brothers and sisters. He's grown up. He's mature. There's peace in Narnia, so we see that we've solved the story problem. We've also solved the motivating problem, which was war in the world and in the family. The war in the world has not been solved. They didn't do VE Day in the book or the movie, but the peace within the family has been restored. So there's our motivating problem. In Inside Out, the emotions are in a new equilibrium. They're working together. That's the solution of our story problem. Riley gets on the team, and we see through montages and stuff that she still has friends, and she's making more friends, and that's the solution of our motivating problem. And there we go. That's how I think about story structure, from our structure, our character arc, and our problem arc. This was a long video. It was a little bit messy. I'm so sorry. But I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did like this video, give it a big thumbs up. If you're looking for more examples, I'm posting a spreadsheet on my Substack. So the link will be available through Substack. You can subscribe there, and I'll put the link below as well. In order to see more examples of this that might be a slightly more cohesive, I will go fix that line break that had me have an apparent defeat around the middle of this video. I'm Nicole Wilbur. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.